Greetings all. We're going to give it a few more minutes before we get started. Please bear with us. Thank you. So, this is Andrea.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the special September edition of the CB8 Social Justice Committee. We're on a different day than usual because in observance of Rosh Hashanah earlier this week. And I am just so pleased that we're able to have our speakers here today. Dr. Tran, should we wait a little bit longer for your co-presenters?
Hi, Sarah. I think we should get started and then they would join us in a few minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Great. Well, I'd like to, I guess before we begin, Will, can you, Will Brightbill is our district manager, and he'll go through kind of how our online service here works.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sandrea. So for everyone, if this is your first time joining us, welcome, and we're excited to have you here. So the first thing you'll notice is that you're muted, and you're going to stay muted throughout the duration of the meeting, except for when one of the two co-chairs calls on you. Following the presentation, by our presenters today. The co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions icon on the bottom of your screen and pressing the raise hand button. It's not the wave or the thumbs up. Those will disappear, and we'll miss that. If you press it multiple times, you should only press it once, but if you press it multiple times, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand, and then *6 to unmute whenever you're called upon. Be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once one of the co-chairs calls on you. If you're having any problems with Zoom, the chat is available for technical support. It is not to ask questions of the co-chairs or the presenters. They will never see those chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you may need to go to the participant section where you'll find the raise hand feature there. And finally, we encourage you not to raise your actual hand or wave at the screen to get our attention. There's a lot of folks here and we may miss you. So if you're having problems, chat me and I'm here to support. Now, I'll hand it back over to Sarah and Sandrea.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Will. Alrighty, so for those of you who've been to these meetings before, you know my my co-chair Sandrea Coleman, who she and I lead this commit together, and we came across a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is among the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And this is a journal that publishes everything from basic science to applied science, and it's really exceptional when social science publications are in PNAS. And so the fact that we have an author from this paper here to speak to us, it's not just an incredible privilege for us at this committee, but also just underscoring how important this research is, that that this global scientific journal would publish its results. And so with us to kick us off today is Dr. Van Tran. He is an associate professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. So yay, New York City universities. And Dr. Tran's research interests include race, ethnicity, immigration, neighborhoods, urban poverty, social inequality, and public policy. And so I will hand it over to him to lead this discussion of the paper that he and his co-authors, who will join us soon, have published. And I'm looking forward to us talking about the implications of this paper, and then having a discussion in this committee on what we think are potential ways that we can address this through public policy. So, Dr. Tran, I hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Sarah and Sandrea, for this wonderful invitation to speak and to share with you our research. I'm very excited because one of the privileges of being an academic is to be part of the broader conversation, especially when it comes to our own city and our own neighborhoods. Let me try to share my screen before I get started. And if I succeed, we will see. Can you see my screen?
We
Yes.
see the preview version. Yes, there we go.
Better.
Yes.
All right. All right, so I would like to acknowledge my three co-authors. Two of them will be here shortly. Jay Holder and Ivan Halef, and Brett Merrick at the OHU of St. Louis. I would say it's not an exaggeration that without Jay and Ivan, this paper would not have been written. So I'm grateful to both of them for their tremendous insight, patience, and contribution to this paper. The paper really started out with them coming to me and ask if I could work with them in writing this paper. They were both former students of mine at Columbia when I taught in 2019. And they said to me that this is our life story and experiences. Is there any way that we could convey this to the broader society in a more rigorously scientific way? And that's the beginning of this paper. So as Sarah has said, our paper was published just a few weeks ago in PNAS. All of our slides have a link on the bottom. So if you're interested in any particular paper and pieces of information, I encourage you to go there to look up more details. The paper really started out with a very fundamental premise, which is that the US carceral system is truly the most punitive in the entire world. Here we have the number of incarcerated people in 2019, right before the pandemic. And you could see here that 1 in 5 incarcerated individuals came from the United States. So we are truly unique in our ability and capacity and willingness to incarcerate individuals and adopt that as one way to penalize them. And for those of you who are familiar with this debate, you have also heard about the rise of mass incarceration for the last 4 decades. Here is a graph showing you the number of total incarceration between 1980 and 2020. And what you're seeing here is it peaked around 2008 to be more precise, and then it has declined slightly until 2019, but it's still a tremendous number of people. And it's not going to be surprising to many of you that this crisis of mass incarceration disproportionately affected young men, specifically young Black and Hispanic men from poor neighborhoods. So the impact of mass incarceration is incredibly concentrated among some communities and some neighborhoods across the city. At the same time, you know, incarceration's impact goes beyond just those who are incarcerated. Now we have 2.3 million who are currently incarcerated, but also forgive me, I just realized the share screen doesn't seem to do what I wanted it to do. So just 1 second. All right. So we know that in 2019, 2.3 million were incarcerated, but really the impact was much more than that. There are 19 million with a felony conviction in our country and 77 million people with a criminal record. More importantly, about 113 million people in the US have an immediate family member currently or previously incarcerated. That's roughly 1 in 3 Americans. And the proportions are highest among Blacks, 63%, 48% among white, among Hispanic, and 42% among whites. So incarceration, you know, it really affects a lot of families and communities across the country, and New York City is no exception. One of the features of incarceration is highly spatially concentrated. Some of you might have heard about the metaphor $1 million blocks, which are urban census blocks for which the cost of imprisoning people was upward of $1 million in the 2000s. Just think about that. We are spending $1 million per block just locking people up instead of investing the resources in helping them finding a path towards mobility. And that's the contradiction in our current system. One example from 2003, 31 men from 4 blocks in Brownsville, Brooklyn accounted for $4.4 million in imprisonment cost, a tremendous waste. And if you think about the entire Brooklyn, we spent $359 million to lock people up in 2003. Here's another view of this spatially concentrated incarceration I was just telling you about. In these 11 blocks in Brooklyn, we spent almost $12 million to incarcerate people also in 2003 from the $1 Million Blocks project. mapping project from Colombia. So this is where we come in. Lots of research have documented what we call the pipelines to prison from poor neighborhood. We have heard of, the school to prison pipeline, the poverty to prison pipeline, the cradle to prison pipeline, and the community to prison pipeline. All of these pipelines pointed to the reality that individuals who grew up in poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country are often channeled into the prison system through a variety of different pathways. Our paper pointed to the public housing to prison pipeline as a distinct pipeline that has yet to be identified. And we used the case of New York City to document this, which I'll show you in the next few slides. And we also pointed to a few possible mechanisms underlying this public housing to prison pipeline in New York City. We can come back to this in much more details, hopefully in our discussion. And I also should say that I won't talk for too much because I wanted this session to be as interactive as possible so that we can have a conversation about this topic and possibly some solutions for the challenge that we're facing. But three possible mechanisms underlie this relationship that we documented in our paper. The first is the hypersurveillance of NYCHA development. And for those of you who grew up in NYCHA or currently live in NYCHA, this is not going to be a surprising finding to you. And the second is, related to the hypersurveillance is the hyperpolicing of NYCHA developments through a variety of different policing tactics, which, unfortunately rendered NYCHA residents much more likely to encounter the police and also rendered those encounters often much more negative than they should be. And over the last 10 years or so, there has been a lot of reliance on surveillance technology in, all types of housing situations, but in particular, public housing in New York City. So this public housing to prison pipeline that I just sort of pointed to you, how do we do this research? Just one slide on the kind of technicalities behind it. I won't get too detailed and technical, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. There are two key measures for the study that we use in the paper. The first is the incarceration rate for the census tract. So the study we're doing here is focused on census tract as a proxy for neighborhood. And for those of you who might not be familiar, a census tract has an average population of 4,000 to 8,000. New York City has 2,095 census tracts across the entire city, 5 boroughs. And the key measure for concentrated incarceration is the incarceration rate for the census tract out of 100,000 people. Actually, no, out of 1,000 people. And the second variable that's important to us is the presence of a NYCHA development in a census tract, which is to say that does the presence and absence of such a development matter for a neighborhood? What we're going to argue is the presence of a NYCHA development is associated with increased risk of concentrated incarceration for the people who live in those tracts. So these are two key measures for the paper, which you'll see in the graph and tables that are coming up soon. We use a variety of data sources. They're all geocoded, meaning they have exact addresses or locations, so you can, basically map this spatially, because the spatial component is important for this entire paper and project. It really measures the situation in 2010. And as I hinted at the beginning of the presentation, 2010 was when incarceration really peaked over the last 4 decades. 2010 also had the advantage of having the data available and comprehensive for our analyses. And when we were writing this paper, data from 2020 have not become available yet. Mm-hmm. So here are some key findings, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. One is incarceration rates we found in NYCHA tracts are basically 4.6 times higher than those in non-NYCHA tracts. And they're even higher, 5.9 times in Manhattan and 6.5 times in Brooklyn. This points to the uneven distribution, obviously, of incarceration across not just neighborhoods, which we proxy using census tract, but also across different boroughs in the city. Strikingly, in 2010, half of all the incarcerated people in New York State prisons were residents of New York City prior to incarceration. Half of New York State prisoners, the incarcerated population, came from New York City. And among them, 1/3 came from census tracts with public housing developments, even though such tracts accounted for only 15% of the New York City's population. So this is an example, once again, of the deeply concentrated spatially nature of the incarceration crisis that we face. Moreover, 17% of the incarcerated population in New York State came from only 372 census tracts in New York City, once again, with public housing developments, even though these tracts accounted for only 6.3% of New York State's population. A 3 times representation, if you will, compared to the average contribution across different parts of the state. Now, what's more important is we are just saying that you don't have to live in a NYCHA development to be impacted. Even when you live in a NYCHA development adjacent tract, you're also affected. So it has nothing to do with whether you are a NYCHA resident, which again, you could argue, might be more impacted for various social and other political and cultural reasons. But we are just saying that, the very act of living and growing up in a neighborhood with the presence of NYCHA building next to you also increase your risk of incarceration, controlling for everything else that we know of. And when you look at the NYCHA tracts, 94% of them reported rate of incarceration above the median value for non-NYCHA tract. This is somewhat technical, so let me explain. Which is to say that almost all NYCHA tracts had higher rates of incarceration compared to the median middle point for all of the other tracts across the city. Here's the first graph that show you this. If you ignore the black dot on this map, what you're going to see is basically a map of incarceration rate per 100,000 people. So the darkest red shading basically are the highest incarceration rate. So you see that there are pockets of the city. Once again, ignore the black dots for now. You see the pockets of the city in the Bronx, Harlem, parts of central Brooklyn, that basically reported extremely high rates of incarceration. And as you might expect, the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, various parts of Lower Manhattan, much of South Brooklyn, and Northern Queens have the lowest rate of incarceration. And by the way, if you see this right here on the further right-hand side, in Queens, these are basically some of the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Queens that the Black middle class have moved into. And as you can see, incarceration rates are also very, very high here. One of the key findings is basically there's a strong association between the Black composition of the neighborhood and rates of incarceration, which I'll come to next. Now, I invite you to look at the black dot now. Each black dot is the location of one NYCHA development. So we have, them scattered across the city, and as you also know, that is not random, right? East Harlem has a lot of the NYCHA developments, and then certainly the South Bronx and also Central Brooklyn. And what's striking to us when we map out the relationship between these dots and the tract was how closely related they are, how adjacent they are to the part of the city with the darkest shades of red, which basically are the highest levels of incarceration. Let me also note that we're only talking about association. We're not talking about causation, because our data doesn't allow us to conclude that one causes the other, but we are seeing a very, very strong correlation, association between the presence of these buildings and incarceration rate. So if you look at the neighborhood characteristic for NYCHA tracts and non-NYCHA tracts, you're going to see very, very different demographic characteristics, but also some very similar, some similar characteristics. So let me start with incarceration rate. As I already said to you, this is the average for all New York tracts, 2095 that we analyzed. This one right here is basically only NYCHA tracts, and that's 372 tracts. And then these are the non-nitrate tracts, and this is the ratio of nitrate over non-nitrate tract, which tells you how disproportionately out of proportion they might be. So starting with population, you can see that on average, the tracts are roughly the same, right? The ratio of 1 is basically indicating proportionality between the two types of tracts. So, in terms of young people aged 18 and 35, they're also roughly the same. And this is important because younger people are often among the most likely to be incarcerated, given, the age-crime association that has been well documented. What is most striking is nitrate tracts are basically 8 times more likely to have Black residents. So an average nitrate tract is 40% Black compared to only 4.65% among the non-nitrate tracts. So there's a very clear association there. And in terms of Hispanic, 27% nitrate. The average Hispanic population in nitrate tracts is 27.4% compared to 16.5% in non-nitrate tract. Now I want to draw your attention to 2 final measures that are really important. And the first is the 3-year average crime rate per 100,000 residents. What you could see here is in the non-nitrate tracts, crime rates were roughly identical to the rest of New York City, okay? It is slightly elevated, 502.89 in nitrate tracts, but that difference is basically 1.02 in terms of the ratio, suggesting that crime rates are almost virtually identical between nitrate tracts and non-nitrate tracts. And this is one important finding because it demystifies the association between nitrate development and crime. Often we have the perception that nitrate developments are associated with higher crime rates. Our data from 2010 show that it's not. What is strikingly different, though, is the SQF rate, and this stands for Stop, Question, and Frisk rate. And this data come from NYPD, and what you're seeing here is basically the rates in nitrate tracts are basically about 3 times higher than the non-nitrate tract. And this is the key difference, and this is one of our measures of hypersurveillance, which I hinted to earlier as one mechanism that link the public housing development to the prison pipeline. So that is essentially what we are saying, that these areas are, experiencing higher levels of surveillance, and this explains why they're also more likely to be incarcerated. This graph show you 2 different relationships. One is the percent Black in a neighborhood for non-nitrate neighborhoods and for nitrate neighborhood. I'm looking at A and B, the 2 panels at the top. And on the y-axis, we have predicted incarceration rate. So the way to read this graph is very simple. So if we start with 40% right here, okay? This is telling us that in an average non-nitrate tract with 40% Black, the predicted incarceration rate is about 200 per 100,000 residents. In a neighborhood that is a non-nitrate tract that has 100% Black, then the incarceration rates are predicted to be about 250. But what's most important is, as you can see here, that even a nitrate tract with no Black population has higher rates, extremely high rates compared to the non-nitrate tract. So the lines on the right-hand side is at an elevated level compared to the left. That's the key point, right? And this is controlling for everything else that we know of, in terms of, neighborhood poverty and other characteristics of the neighborhoods and crime, so that all of the differential between the 2 types of neighborhoods could not explain away the differences in the elevated incarceration rates in nitrate tracts. On the bottom 2 panels C and D, you see the same relationship, but mapped out in terms of concentrated disadvantage. And this is sort of an index, a measure of how disadvantaged a neighborhood is, and that combines, poverty and unemployment and other measures at the tract level to show us that these higher levels of disadvantage basically map on more disadvantaged tracts. And you can see that the slope for non-nitrate tract is steeper, and is less steep for the nitrate tracts, but also at, again, an elevated level at every single level of comparable concentrated disadvantage across the 2 types of neighborhood. So what we were also interested in is, is it just tract or, what about other types of spatial scales like, zone elementary schools and zip codes and NYPD precincts? And what we are seeing here is across the 4 different types of spatial aggregation, we see, again, the same pattern. And the pattern is robust with regards to these different definitions of, what we think of as a neighborhood or a space in which people live. And it's elevated, again, for the red bars, which are for the nature tracts and or nature present in the particular school zone. So that's our finding. I won't get into the policy implications too much, but hopefully I can invite all of you to ask any questions, and I think we can have a conversation about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We want to wait for the other presenters are here too, right? So maybe, well, how do you want to do it, Sarah? It's up to you. Maybe you want to unpack some people now, some questions, or at the whole.
Should we have Ivan and Jay share any comments or feedback before we go to questions?
That'd be better.
So I see Ivan on the camera and I see Jay here as well. And just for reference, Ivan Calef and Jay Holder are from Columbia at their Center for Justice, and Ivan is also a student there. Jay is a graduate student as well as the director of the National Executive Center, and sorry, National Executive Council. And so, Will, if you could please unmute Ivan and Jay, and for them to provide comments or context or anything that you'd like with regard to the research that Dr. Tran just presented that they all collaborated in. And then we'll move to Dr. Guilford's question.
I see Ivan's unmuted. Jay, you can unmute whenever you're ready.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, I'm teaching a class right now, and I couldn't get nobody to cover, so I'm in and out of both Zooms right now.
I'm in the middle of, I don't have anything further to add. I think Dr. Tran did a fantastic job covering all the essentials. And any questions, please shoot questions. I'm sorry, I'm bouncing between 2 meetings as well. So, but I think Dr. Tran did a fantastic job really covering all the basics. So I don't think I have any value that I can add at this point. So.
Thank you for all of you all co-authoring this. Thank you so much for that. We just wanted to make sure y'all, if y'all had something to say, y'all can speak, but then y'all are here for questions, whoever's on the screen. Yeah, okay, but thank you. You can call Sarah, hands up.
Okay, great. And Dr. Tawana Guilford.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Dr. Tran, I'd like to thank you for such an amazing presentation. I'd like to thank the host and the coordinators of this event. This was a really interesting Zoom. It was very powerful, actually. I'll briefly share my story. I am the sister of a man who was wrongfully convicted in a NYCHA residence. And for years, since he was 12, he's now 32 years old, he has been a part of a grooming process with a series of wrongful arrests that got dismissed. So this really resonates with my story because I have spoken on many Zooms, many panels, spoken with my community leaders about this issue that has been rampant in the NYCHA developments. I also co-founded a Stop False Police Reporting initiative based on my family's life story because it is taking so much for us to put our lives back together after 2 decades worth of terror from the criminal justice system. So I like to just kind of like share my information in the chat. And if you all need someone with a lived experience who has been through what the research states, I am more than willing to share my story on any platform or continue to join your Zooms or come to live forums because it helps to give some context that this data, this very important data is real. So I like the opportunity to put my information in the chat if that's possible. And again, keep doing the great work, because this research really brings to life what families like mine have gone through for generations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Dr. Guilford, something that you said really resonated with me. You talked about repeated wrongful arrests, and that 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 even if a person isn't incarcerated or isn't wrongfully convicted, that the experience of constantly being harassed, constantly being under the eye of police, um, and being arrested for things that you didn't do, that being able to express what that means and the
Yeah,
toll of that on someone's life is I that that just really strikes me from what you
yes,
said.
it does. It's very traumatic, right? And it's traumatic for the person who is continuously being incarcerated, but it's also traumatic for the family. It's traumatic for, those who love that individual who wants to support. It's financially taxing, it's emotionally taxing, and it's traumatizing, to say the least. So when you think about the scale, 20 years of repeated incarceration, and mind you, those arrests leave a stain on the person's record, so that when it came time for my brother's wrongful incarceration back in 2013, they saw the laundry list of arrest, his prior conviction, but it made it appear as if he was a person who was an absolute danger and a terror to to the community. So, like I stated, it's a grooming process. And not only was he impacted by this, but all of his friends, in that cohort were impacted by incarceration of some sort. And it's like, if you train a mouse to be a mouse, when you put a cat into the equation, the mouse is still going to behave like a mouse. So it was like a cat and mouse game that happened with the young men in the community and the police officers. So they just kind of played into the narrative that was already set up for them, and they had no idea that was happening.
Mm, mm,
That
Yes,
story's
thank you
not.
for that. That's really important. And just say that Jay and Ivan, are both, deeply experienced and have friends and family members who fit this exact story. So I'm very, very happy to hear that it resonates with your experiences as well. And this is also why we wrote the paper, because we wanted it to be above and beyond just our own personal experiences, that there's something broader and more kind of scientific out there that we are just part of a broader story.
Yeah, Dr. Gilbert, I just want to just congratulate you on all your work, and also, it's unfortunate that you're one of many people who families are dealing with this stuff. It's not just a New York thing. We see the same thing, all around the country. I have family members in different places, and it's the same repeated patterns. One of the goals that we hope to gain out of this research is not only being able to bring these stories to the forefront with some scientific data to support it, but we also have a follow-up meeting in October sometime, in which our policy team, because the NEC, which is spearheaded this particular research with our partners, is broken up into a research team, a program team, and a policy team, and we have some legal counsel that's manage that particular department. Some of them are formerly incarcerated lawyers as well. That's on that team. So we're hoping that once that our research team, led by Professor Tran, once that he put this information out, we're hoping that the next time we come back, that if the community has any suggestions or recommendations for people that's living there, that would be gratefully helpful, and we probably can put some solutions together and address some of our city officials and others who can help alleviate these conditions that was going in here. And the last thing I want to say is, somebody like myself, who I don't want get into my crime, definitely not on recording, but they were looking for me for 4 years, right? And it took them 4 years to catch me for the crime that they was looking for. It was a very serious crime. and how I was able to avoid law enforcement. It was simple. I just stayed away from all public housing developments inside the city. And that's how I was able to live inside New York City in Manhattan, free for 4 years and looking for me some serious charges, but not having any police interaction, because I know for my life, being and growing up around public housing and others, that's where the police are likely to stop, question, and frisk you for no reason whatsoever. So that's how I managed to avoid the system for that amount of time.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Jay.
And Dr. Guilford, if you could add your organization's information. If you put it in the chat, Robert, who's managing our chat, can post it for all the participants here today. And then we'll also add it to our minutes for the meeting, so people referring back to the meeting can also connect with your organization.
Thank you. And thank you, Jay, for sharing your story as well. Again, I'm truly appreciative of this conversation. I really am. I feel relieved knowing that, it's not just us, and that there's actual research that supports, our life story. So thank you. I look forward to hearing from everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to sort of chime in a little bit, I'm sorry. And this paper had sort of a dual purpose, like sort of once you look past the numbers, one of the purposes, so we work at Columbia University. So this esteemed Ivy League university sits in the middle of one of the brownest communities on the planet, right in the middle of Harlem. And yet the relationship between the Columbia community and the surrounding communities is horrible. As a matter of fact, the narrative that's told to the community, the Columbia community, is that the neighborhoods surrounding are dangerous. And that translates to that the people are dangerous. And that translates to the Black and brown people are dangerous. And we all know that the 99% of the people, people do dumb shit everywhere. They do stupid things, they commit terrible crimes, but we all know that 99% of the people that live in the surrounding areas are beautiful, hardworking, brilliant, talented people who just want the same things that everybody else wants. They're struggling to make ends meet. They want their kids to go to good schools. They want the kids safe. They want the communities clean. They want the communities safe. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources. So one of the purposes of this paper is to change that narrative that those communities are dangerous, right? And another purpose is to change not just the narrative, but to change the narrators. Who's telling the story, right? Because we have too many people telling our story that don't look like us, that don't have our life experience. And the story that's getting told is not true. It's not real. It's not based on facts. It's not based on data. It's based on lies and distortions, and it's very purposeful. So I think that this, it's two purposes of this particular research is to change the narrative and to change the narrators. And let's get the real story out there. We have to collect our own data, do our own research, and put it out there and tell the real story.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Glad the guys got warmed up. I know they're busy too, so it's good to hear from them because they are the co-authors. So we wanted to make sure you all had a voice. You could continue on, but I know Dr. Jessie Fields is next, and you can continue on so we can unmute her. I'm kind of excited that she showed up to this meeting. I've done a lot of activism and organizing with her around public housing. She's a physician and so much more. Professor, I'm sure she has a lot of hats, so but she can say hello and give her comment. But she's from CICA, which is the Committee for Independent Community Action, so founded by Dr. Lenore Fulani. So it's good to have CICA in the house.
Thank you very much, Sandrea. It's great to be here. I'm so glad that I was able to attend. As Sandrea was saying, I'm part of the Committee for Independent Community Action, CICA, and we're under the umbrella of the All Stars Project, which is a youth development program that works with young people in poor and underserved communities, in the communities where public housing is, and also the CICA is advocating for the residents to organize and to lead in support of the future of their homes, which is really endangered with the recent privatization. Well, it's been going on for a long time. So that's a big issue. The thing that I'm very, very, an important part of my own life, not only being a physician in the community and working in Harlem, but the health issues are tremendous in public housing. And I work with the All-Stars, with CICA, and with the All-Stars in particular as an after-school program to bring success and opportunity to our communities with the young people. It's after school using performance. So one of the things that I was struck by that I wanted to ask, there were two questions I had. One is that your study finds, and thank you, Dr. Tran and Ivan and Jay, and all of you for this wonderful paper. I read it, and I'm so glad that you're taking it out and talking to the community about it. It seemed like, if I heard correctly, one of the findings is that crime is not higher in NYCHA census tracts or non-NYCHA census tracts. It's not higher in NYCHA tracts than non-NYCHA census tracts, non-NYCHA census tracts. However, surveillance is higher. Police presence and surveillance and incarceration is higher. So that's one question to sort of explore how public policy can decrease surveillance and bring more positive education, development, social services, and opportunity to our communities, which is something that I think is very important. So just to kind of get into the more policy solutions. And the other part of that solution, and thank you, Dr. Guilford, I appreciated your remarks and hearing about your work. Part of it, which is mentioned in the paper, part of the solution is including the residents of public housing in coming up and being very active in developing new approaches to these issues. So I had a question, particularly on page 7 of 8, in the paragraph ahead of where you talk about materials and methods. It says that, moreover, the opinions of public housing residents should be solicited in policymaking processes. And you mentioned the example of the recent passage of the NYCHA Public Housing Preservation Trust. And then the other part talks about reimagining safety and security in public housing, which could certainly must include the residents protecting their homes and not being harassed and overly surveilled. But the issue is that the NYCHA Public Housing Preservation Trust, as I'm sure Sandrea and others know, was not implemented with the voice of the residents. In fact, the residents were excluded. It's a privatization plan that completely, NYCHA does not include the residents. It says it does, but it does not. And if you talk to residents, well, the great thing about this study is it's one study. Now I think the next step is to actually talk to the residents about what they would consider workable solutions, and to involve them and to see what they think about this and to get their input, in the community. So those are my questions, and thank you very much for this study.
Definitely thank you again, Dr. Phil, and all your incredible work and your contributions to just try to make the world, how cliche as it sounds, is a greater place for people to live in. So from our understanding with the preservation part of it, that the Tenants Association presidents, I forgot how to forgive me if I don't have the complete structure together. But those representatives from the Tenants Association, from the different districts, how it's broken down, that they voted for that. Is that not correct? That the Tenants Association presidents, what is it? How's that system broken down again? If somebody wants to elaborate on it.
Yeah, Sandrea can elaborate, but yeah, the vote, the state legislature passed the Housing Preservation Trust. The governor signed the legislation. I attended a hearing that NYCHA held about 2 weeks ago. There were about 100 or more residents and tenant association presidents, every single one except for I think 3, about 98% spoke against.
Right.
They were not included. They did not vote on it.
Right. Was it the residents themselves, or are we talking about the current structure that they had with their tenant association presidents? Because what was explained to us, that the different tenants association presidents, they voted yes. So we wouldn't have had, had any a really good understanding on, we know that the tenants association, they go through an election process themselves to get voted in. So if they are there representing them, then maybe the residents need to try to find a better representation, which is probably indicative of the larger society when, you know, these problems exist in the first place because we don't have proper representation. So that was the one thing that I want to respond to, and anybody else can jump in.
That narrative is actually not true when it comes to the totality of all of the developments that are not under RAD, rental assistance demonstration, which that they move out of the portfolio. So what's left is still a whole lot of public housing stock. And, you know, even if you take residents or presidents, because they have a council of presidents, and you take groups of them to vote, that's not still a true vote. So what happens with the Preservation Trust now, they have to come to the development and do a vote with the resident association.
Yep.
One of the problems, and that's why SECA and the Homeless Housing Coalition, what I'm co-founding One Night Park, has a lot of us that are trying to save Section 9. We're trying to get the accurate information out to the residents so we can vote no, come down and vote, because it's from development to development. So although, and then even if it happens, it's still going to take 2 years for them to really implement it. Right. So it's a form of privatization, and you know, it just, we lose some protections, and you know, it's selling us out, and we don't want it. We want to either be able to manage our developments with Resident Management Corp, and we don't have to do the whole totality of it, but we want to have a say in what goes on because we live there. You know, like for me, and housing resident, I can't. I'm surveilled on cameras. When you speak about surveillance, if I put up a poster to let people know I'm feeding that weekend, the public, I get a letter threatening my eviction. You understand what I'm saying? And how they see it on the camera. The camera should be surveillance for crime, not for us trying to feed the community. So that's a whole nother animal. That's the systemic racism in public housing. But I don't know who actually y'all got the information from, but it's kind of still a little inaccurate in a sense, and not on you. That's whoever said it, because the vote still has to come down. And like Dr. Phil said, with legislation, and then it went to the governor and she signed it.
Right. So thank you for sharing. And I definitely it's kind of crazy to hear that you're going out there to put a poster to feed the community and get this type of feedback. This is what they're doing with taxpayer money, and I know, it's a terrible. So when you're saying that when they put out the preservation this policy decision, that none of the NYCHA President's Association or nobody from that council was involved with that process?
They could have been involved with it to a degree, but it's a split. Like, everybody doesn't want it, you know.
Right.
And then
So that's the thing that we wanted to clarify here. We knew that I don't live in public housing anymore, right? So I wasn't a part of voting for a tenants association president. We were made aware that there was some council people that voted for it to even get to the point that it was now. And what we're saying is we don't agree. We just research is trying to highlight this, concerned citizens. I still have relatives in different NYCHA developments around the city, and I'm not even sure that they participate with the voting process because they're frustrated, right? But the one thing, so now what you're highlighting, that most of the residents don't want this, right? And that's what we hope to come out of the second portion of this, gather as many residents as you can so we can actually record, let them sit with our policy team so the policy team can help address some of these larger issues that the residents are going through.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be great to hear the voice of the residents. There are, 500,000, 600,000 people who live in public housing. Many adults and young people. So I think it would be great to talk to them, to hear from them. The Preservation Trust transfers from Section 9, which is public housing, to Section 8, which is vouchers. And the residents lose their protections in terms of the rents, the lack of, the difficulty in evictions. They lose their federal rights to prevent evictions. Evictions go up, people lose succession rights. So a lot of people don't understand that that's what happens. It goes from public housing to vouchers. Public housing has been eliminated in many parts of this country. New York City is the last place where there's a major public housing. There's major public housing for many people. So I know this is a conversation we should continue. I would like to continue it with all of you to go into it more deeply and to invite you to come and meet the residents who live in public housing and come to some of the tenant association meetings and just talk to the residents, because I think it's just so important. There's so many people involved. As you point out, people who live in those neighborhoods, not necessarily even just the ones who live in public housing. So
Sorry, can you drop information and the seeker information in the chat?
yes,
So that
absolutely. Thank you.
that's here. Also, our next meeting is October 24th, because I don't know whoever, I hope everybody can stay on, and that'll be on policy. So I just want to make sure that's noted. Part 2 of part 1 is in a month. Go ahead. Cool. I think that was that, right? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you guys for the education. So, we intended to put this information out, and I'm getting an education right now, so just so everyone knows, we did this work without a single dime, no budget. After work, after school, after our lives, we visited every single housing development in the city with zero budget. And we hopefully we can get a budget for the next research project. And but I just appreciate all of you for the education you're giving us now, because all this information is vital, and it's important for us to know, and it's important for the public to know. So I just want to say thank you and kudos to all of y'all, and I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, who's next on the list? On the hands up. Thank you.
Before we go to Victor, I see your hand up, Victor. I just wanted to point to Robert posted for us that we want to collect feedback from the community, and that we're going to share with Dr. Tran, with Ivan, and with Jay. And this would kind of help feed the part 2 meeting that we're having next week. And so if you'd like to distribute to your networks, the email for the community board is info@cb8m.com. And if you would just put CB8 social justice in the subject line, then we can, Robert and Will can collate those emails and share them over to us. So info@cb8m.com, and putting CB8 social justice in the subject line. So any of your reactions from tonight, feedback from community members who are directly impacted, we would love to hear it all. So please don't hesitate to distribute that email and information. And so we'll go to Victor. Thanks for your patience, Victor.
Yes, good evening all. Can you hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Victor Edwards. I'm a Community Board 9 member. Community Board 9 sits in the Valley of Manhattan, Manhattanville and Grant, 2 of the developments that are right here along with Columbia. My background, I work for the Board of Ed here in Harlem at one of the schools that is heavily impacted as a guidance counselor. After that, I worked for NYCHA. I was a NYCHA employee for the last 30 years. I managed all NYCHA developments on Staten Island and then all NYCHA developments in the Bronx. So I appreciate the paper and the work that has been done and the speakers that have come before me. I'm listening and learning and taking it all in. And I look at it from 2 different perspectives. I look at it from a management perspective, but being a person of color, I looked at it often from the residents' perspective. When I started my first job in housing, I was in Melrose Houses in the Bronx, and my second month on the job, I was caught in the middle of a shootout between 2 people with a MAC-10 and an AK-47. Okay, I barely escaped that and went on to my career from there. And I got to see, as I said, both sides. I attended all tenant association meetings and spoke with residents, spoke with longtime residents, and a lot of residents that lived in the public housing developments that I managed were very fearful of even coming out of their houses, especially older residents. They were fearful of getting their bags snatched, being held up in the hallways of the elevators. And I walked the grounds by myself often, day, night, whenever, and felt that as well. I mean, I often blended in. Some people knew who I was, other people didn't, but I could feel the fear of other people in the neighborhood. I work with the police oftentimes. I saw the surveillance that was put on young people and people in the area, and even the surrounding community in the Bronx and in Staten Island. So I saw that, but I also often spoke to the young people, because I have a social work background, about making things better. You know, to this day, I often hear them say, right, I live in Harlem, that they're going to get theirs by any means necessary, which means sticking someone up often. I advocated often for more programs to educate our young people and show them different ways, trades that they can get into and succeed. On the community board, I also work with the Osborne Association, and I work with the Tashana Chicken Murphy Foundation, which helps people coming out of incarceration to a better life. People who go in, I say, from the drug trade in particular, that's what they know when they come back, and they're going to go back to that unless they gain something else in prison. And this country is not about rehabilitation. It's just about incarceration. So we try to help them look at different ways of being successful without going back to what they were doing before. It's been a, you know, it's a long road, and it's difficult because in this society where people take so much value in money and things of that nature, material things, young people see that and said, that's what I want to be. But I often tell them, you can be that by being a carpenter, by being a tradesperson, by going to college. You don't have to be on the corner, you know, slinging to make that kind of money. But the examples they see within the housing developments, around the housing developments, unfortunately, it's like that. A lot of people that have done good things don't come back. I'm working on something now called Coming Back to Give Back. Manhattanville houses, one of the New York One reporters is from Manhattanville. I know quite a few educators that are from Manhattanville houses. Come back and show young people that there's another way to do this other than what you see on the street, that glamorous life. You can still drive a Benz, you can still get bottle service at the club, but you're doing it legally and not looking over your shoulder. So just saying that to say that we need to impress upon young people that there's other ways to go about this. Ivan and Jay, I do a lot of work with Columbia, and it's a battle. It's about, you would think that Columbia, being a university it is, would be so much more interested in the surrounding community. But for us to do anything as a community board, it's a fight, right? I try to organize stuff, even our community board meetings. We've held more at City College meetings than we've held at Columbia. It took 4 years for us to get into that new building there. And I'm fighting now to see if we can have at least quarterly meetings at Columbia. I said, bring young people from Manhattanville and Graham on campus. Let them see people who look like them, people of color, women that are at Columbia doing great things. And this is what we need to impress upon. So I don't want to go over my time limit, but just to say that we are here trying to help. This is a great forum. I look forward to reading this paper thoroughly and sharing it with my colleagues on the board and doing what we can to uplift young people in the community in general. So I thank you for your time, and thank you for the people who contributed to that paper. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And don't forget to rejoin us on the 24th of October. Got to plug that in. I just want to
definitely be back.
Okay. And I just want to piggyback on when you spoke about, you know, what they're doing in the streets, the young people and stuff like that. And we also have to shift the blame to the city, state, and the federal government because of the lack of disinvestment in public housing. It's not just our repairs. A lot of our community centers are either closed shut or they're privatized. Like, we don't even have an after school program around here. We have to take our kids, you know, several blocks away when we have 2 centers here. So that's a problem. And we're working on, you know, getting things done, but, you know, it's a few people trying to literally save a village, you know. So the disinvestment, like I said, it's not just, it is, yeah, they do see what they see, but we've got to remember, when you don't put value into people that needs that value from them, what else are they going to look to? Unfortunately, and I'm a minister, so I'm not, I know that this investment has harmed our communities and public housing, and we really need that investment in the funding, like I said, for our homes to be preserved, as well as for our after school programs, for our community centers, to give our young men and women something to do. I live in Isaac houses. We have 2 community centers. They are privatized now. And every time there's big events for youth, our kids are disenfranchised, and they were not aware, and they didn't even know it was happening. Right. And that's disrespectful. You know what I'm saying? So I just wanted to share that, because we have to look at everything through all lenses, if you know what I mean, all lenses. And one of the lenses is the disinvestment, the financial disinvestment in the Black and brown people in our community.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a 20-second response, because I want to give a chance. I see some hands raised for them hands, but I'm very aware of Isaac Houses. I think Isaac Houses is maybe one of the only developments in Manhattan that NYCHA police don't police. I think the regular police, that's Isaac, if I'm not mistaken, is one of them over there. I think it's Isaac, where the public housing police don't police there, just the regular precinct does. But it was so much that you said, brother, that you shared. My colleagues has hit me up that we could really spend 3 hours unpacking some of the stuff that you're talking about. You're really close to home. But we are a council, right? A different type of council, and we're going to call on you to help bring some of these solutions. So if it would be so kind of you, right, to make sure that all of the recommendations that you made us aware of, and some of them we might know about, but you talked about some things we're not aware of. Can you please make sure that you list those, so when we come back on the 24th, you all in the policy team can, to start thinking about some interventions. But I want to be quiet, because I want to let somebody else, we can get to everybody else's questions.
Yeah, I just 10 seconds real quick. So thank you for that. So just this Saturday, as a matter of fact, I co-facilitated a tour of Columbia University of family members, young kids from the ages of 8 all the way up to 19. We did a tour of Columbia, of the entire campus, of all the buildings, of the family members of formerly incarcerated people and the folks who are still incarcerated, to let them know that this is, they have every business being here just like everyone else, that this is not a place, a strange world, a strange universe, that this is not some other place that they don't belong. And we had a great time. We had pizza afterwards. We spoke. The young people asked amazing questions, of very pointed questions about, what the atmosphere is like, what the temperature, how Black people are treated on campus, how Black and brown bodies are treated. So this was the very first tour. We're going to make this a regular thing. So we're working, man. And you're right. Columbia's tough, man. And it's not the only university that's tough, but we are here. We're kicking doors open, man. And we need folks like you to ask those hard questions, to challenge, to just to question and to push back, so we can make what we do better and tighter and I just appreciate you. Thank you for that.
Take away, Sarah.
Thank you, Ivan. Erica. Erica's one of our public members. Thank you for your patience, Erica.
This was pretty incredible. Thanks for sharing. I know one of the biggest phrases within this community is that when a loved one is in prison, the whole family is in prison. And the fact that when a loved one comes out of prison, that they can't go back to where they live, and their family can essentially be kicked out of their own homes if they do, is absolutely appalling, because there's no other, in my building where I live on the Upper East Side, I would have no way of knowing if somebody in my building had been to prison, either while they lived here or afterwards. Because in a rental or a co-op or a condo, you don't have that same those same rules, if you will. I'm sure there are other rules in terms of, potential crimes and living close to children. However, the average person living outside of a NYCHA complex, you would have no idea who was next door to you because of privacy rules when you're either buying or renting and the demographics. So it's appalling to me that you come out, you're extremely vulnerable at that point to your surroundings, to recidivism, and you can't go back to your own home, or you can't go to where your family is living for fear that they'll also be thrown out as well. That's insane.
So I just want to respond to that and make a broader comment, which is that for a long, long time, there is a pipeline that our people refer to as the police to public housing pipeline of information, which is really core and central behind the hypersurveillance of NYCHA residents. And this is based on a memorandum of understanding on disclosure and arrest and complaint information between NYPD and NYCHA in 1996, such that NYPD is required to notify NYCHA even when any NYCHA residents were arrested and or committed a crime. And that really is how the address from which that individual came from is placed under surveillance and or potential eviction proceeding. So this pipeline is a different pipeline. And in so many ways, if these pipelines are used in a positive and constructive way, it could be very helpful in terms of monitoring crime and help to increase safety for the residents. But we know that the reality is often the opposite.
It's not used that way.
This pipeline of information is often being abused and taken advantage of at the detriment of NYCHA residents. And that, I think, is the beginning of a conversation that we have to have about change and changing practices. Because when you think about NYCHA, NYCHA is a landlord. And therefore, NYCHA residents shouldn't be subjected to above and beyond requirements and harassment, basically, to live in these buildings. So I think hopefully we can begin some conversations with the NYCHA.
Right. And just to add on to what Professor Tran just said, and I still call him Professor. He hates when I do that. But that's the relationship I had when I came home. I know we researched partners, buddies, and everything else, but I still just call him Professor. But in addition to what he's saying, if anybody uses an address in arrest, somebody can come from somewhere and they don't even have to use a NYCHA. But if they use that address inside of arrest, it's automatically going to start an investigation to that particular residence. And that doesn't exist for nobody else inside the city, right? Okay.
And can someone correct me if I'm wrong? Because I know it has happened in the past, but I don't know if it's still going on. When someone returns from incarceration, if that was where they lived at in NYCHA, and it wasn't a crime on NYCHA premises, and they're either put out on, released probation, parole, or something like that. I actually was part of someone getting back home because I was that neighbor that, opened the door and they were looking, the parole officer was looking, for the family because the person was coming home. But this was some years ago. So my question is that still in place? Because, or is it just, like I said, if they committed the crime in NYCHA, or is it overall? Because if it's overall, then that is problematic. Because we also have to remember that when our family are away, or people's families incarcerated upstate, and when the census come out, families are not counting their family members that are using that address to come back home. So, but they're getting probably, y'all can tell me if I'm wrong, they're probably getting counted upstate, but y'all can let me know because I might be wrong. So any of y'all can answer that for me if y'all have the knowledge. Because
so again, am I, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm,
Yes.
mm-hmm.
So if I committed a crime way outside of NYCHA, as long as it's in New York City, if I commit a crime outside of NYCHA, I get arrested and I give a NYCHA resident address. So I can commit a crime anywhere, but as long as I give an address that's attached to NYCHA, then those eviction proceedings can begin, and the entire family begin criminalized, and so on and so forth. And I can be barred and from my NYCHA, so I don't necessarily have to commit a crime on the NYCHA property, but as long as when I get arrested, I give a NYCHA address to the police. And once they process that address, then they give that information, they funnel that information to NYCHA, and then NYCHA begins to do what it does with regards to how they treat me and the rest of the family. So it doesn't the crime itself doesn't actually have to happen on NYCHA property.
I just was curious about that. So it's about the address that the person is using, basically. Okay, because I know a lady in Queensbridge, it was some situation and she wound up taking her. They was trying to evict her, but it didn't happen. She just took her son off the lease.
If I go out right now and run into some police contact, and if I knew your address and gave it to them, it's going to be an investigation to figure out if I live there. So your apartment is going to come under some scrutiny, and you're going to have to engage with your landlord about who this person was and what's this incident, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting though, but yeah, I'm sure I know people are fighting that because if they're not, if it's the youth and, so people can retain their homes, like they either got to move or they remove the person off the lease. So I know there has to be some ways legally that they can fight it. I would hope. Right. Thank you for the information, guys, because I wasn't too sure. Because I know what I remember from some years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dr. Tran, thank you for referencing the information pipeline, because if you think about, so that's another example of carceralism, right? That that they're using the information for the purposes of creating more police contacts instead of saying, and then this links back to what Sandrea was saying about disinvestment, instead of saying, wow, we have someone returning home and these are all the services we can flood them with to support them. But that's not how the information is being used. And so thank you, Erica, for getting this conversation started. All right, Valerie Mason, you're next. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you. This has been a great start of a conversation. I've been working with women and their families who've been involved in the criminal justice system for over 25 years. And, to your point about people leaving prison and wanting, that an entire family goes to prison, to Ivan's point, the best place many times is for that person to be reunited with their family. And unfortunately, if they are in public housing, they can't go back. And the recidivism rate even goes up higher because they can't be around the people who can help them, who they trust. And we see that a lot. And it's been like that for forever. And, I'm not familiar with the eviction process, but I know that, when you get tossed out of Rikers with a Metro card and a brown bag, and you've got nowhere to go and your family's in public housing, well, where are you? You're on the street, and you don't need the Metro card. You'll be returning to Rikers pretty quickly. And so it's a vicious circle. And it's basically a game you can't win. It's like going to a casino. You're destined for failure. And it's something that, for whatever reason, prisons in the United States and one of the most advanced economies in the world can't seem to get their head around. I do want to talk in particular about the study, though, tonight, because I'm interested. The data is from 2010. My understanding is that stop and frisk hit its peak at 2011. So I'm curious. I mean, this is great data, but I guess my question is, how does the abolishment, if you will, of stop and frisk, has that had any positive effect on the arrest rates, at least in the public housing sector? I don't know if you have any anecdotal data for that.
I can speak to this, and then Jay and Ivan, you could add. Certainly, the abolishment of that policy is very positive because it, by definition, removes a policy that informs and supports the hyper-surveillance that we identified in our paper. I should also say that 2010 was the year when crime rate across the city was at its lowest for decades, and we are seeing an uptick over the last few years as well. So crime rate, as those of you remember, New York City in the 1990s was extremely high. Between 1990 and 2010, there was a dramatic decline of 95% in terms of homicide rate. So we are capturing this particular moment in a few unique ways, right? Incarceration was very high, crime rate was very low, stop and frisk was very high. So if you were to translate this to the current moment, then the answer is yes, stop and frisk has been reduced. Crime rate has gone up a bit more. Then what about the relationship between incarceration and public housing surveillance? My feeling is we don't have the data to address that because we don't have stop and frisk data anymore. So I think we don't want to speculate that it has gone down or gone up because we lack the actual measures, right? So this is the ambivalence I feel about stop and frisk, because too often, as you have heard from the screen today from all of our participants, people know that they have been subjected to and experienced higher levels of surveillance. It's just that we never showed it because we don't have the data to show it. So it's really a contradiction in the way we're collecting this type of data, because beyond stop and frisk, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint, the amount of surveillance that exists in and around a public housing development.
Do you have access to information from arrest records as to address? I mean, is that a FOIA request that you have to make to get that kind of data? Because I would, I mean, and then the other question is.
The answer is yes, we do. And that's really what the data on incarceration come from the Prison Policy Institute, PPI, because you must have arrest records to identify where and in which census tract a particular individual is arrested. And that's how we could, provide all the findings that we discussed today to you, which is, X% of people, in prison in New York State came from, Y% of tract in the city. What we don't have is the SQR and SQF rate, and that I think is problematic because then we don't really get at what we refer to as the mechanism that underlies the pipeline between public housing and prison. So yes, we can update our work to show the association between incarceration rate and the presence of NYCHA developments for 2020. That we can easily do. And in fact, we want to do this not just for New York, but maybe other states and other cities across the country, because the story we're telling is not limited to New York.
Do you have a breakdown of those arrests between men and women?
That's a good question. Jay and Ivan, you know if the data has a gender differential from PPI? I can tell you that our paper, we did not differentiate between men and women. We just take the overall arrest rate, the overall incarceration rate that was published by PPI.
Okay.
But your point is well taken, actually, because I think the more data we can get at the local level, the more nuanced the story that we can tell. So in some sense, one of the limitations of the paper is we rely on only one empirical measure of the hyper-surveillance. We now kind of multivariate model, just to get very technical, because we didn't have other measures such as, the frequency with which the police visited each of the neighborhood, how many police officers were on site at a particular date and time and location. We don't have any of that at all. And that, I think, is my own way of saying that what we have is a very crude measure of, Jay, can you mute on your end?
Yeah, the NYPD.
Oh, you're trying to come in. Okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, the NYPD, they have that data, I believe, broken down in male or female when we were looking at those particular numbers. But one of the real shortcomings of this, and Ivan can weigh in as well, is that because we didn't have no funding, right? If we would have had funding, we would have spoke with at least 250 residents. So we couldn't even speak to residents, right? Because it's one thing that Ivan and I are former residents. Of course, we still got family members in many of these developments, but we would have liked to speak to different residents just about their particular experience. If I want to jump out of research mode for a second, I don't think stop and frisk works, right? And I don't think stop and frisk work because the data shows that I think when it was at its height, they might have searched, for example, 600,000 people, right? And portions of young Black men that they were searching, that they weren't even that many young Black men inside the neighborhood. So they searching the same people over and over again. But what the results that it yielded, it didn't do anything other than create distrust from the community. So in order for a community to function properly, there has to be some collective efficacy. When you're going around harassing people just for being Black and brown inside these spaces, you're just building distrust up. So for some people, they may look at it like, it's keeping them safe, but there's not enough police in the city to police 600,000 residents or the other 8 million, inside that total inside the city. So I don't think stop and frisk works, just to be honest with you, from a personal perspective, not the research perspective, but just somebody that had lived inside these neighborhoods. Okay.
Yeah. I also wanted to address Ivan's point about Columbia. I went to Columbia in 1979, and the same issues that you're talking about today were the same issues back in 1979. And nothing in that relationship has changed at all. Which is, deeply troubling. And it unfortunately, to your point, it's really not unique. Many large Ivy League universities are in inner cities and don't really have any, and even when they're not in inner cities, they're surrounded by communities that are not as, maybe have a population as well off as the students and teachers who are there. And they do an awful job of trying to rectify that. And I just wanted to add, in my work, we've done a lot of work, especially women, I hate to put it in these terms, but, when a woman goes to prison, 67% of all women who go to prison have at least 3 children. Those children, and many of them lose their parental rights. The law does a great job of doing that. But what they don't realize is the key to most women's recovery and rehabilitation is the connection with their children. And it makes them want to lead a really good life. And their children, despite all their mother's crimes, love their mothers. I can't speak to their fathers, unfortunately. I'm sure they do too, but I've only seen it in this context, so I'm only going to speak about what I know. And I've seen people who, have never had a family member incarcerated meet some of these kids and have their heads turned around about how incarceration and punishment works in this society. And I think it's really, really important for people who've never been, who've been blessed and their families have never had a family member who's been incarcerated, to meet the families of people who have loved ones who are incarcerated. And I think those meetings do more for the people who have been blessed and so they get to know that these are real people, like you were saying, Ivan, who just like them. And, but for the grace of God, something happens and their lives are not as fortunate. And I think people then come away with a different kind of attitude about what incarceration in the United States is really all about and how different it is everywhere else in the world. So sorry, I didn't mean to talk so much, but I think those are all good goals. And just kudos to the co-chair this committee for shedding more light on this and having a public conversation. that because inclined to be humane than we thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Looks like my screen is freezing a little bit. I just want to add, I'm a former member of service, civilian supervisor with NYPD. I'm medically retired, and I remember the stop and frisk, the form we used to call UF 250, because I used to order forms, and it's definitely a form of harassment and terrorism to Black and Brown communities. They literally terrorize the people, because I remember when I used to work midnights, 4 to 12, and the first platoon would come on and they would drive me home. They would look at each other and go, should we get them? Should we get them? And they would drive the car really fast while I'm in there, and it's near the public housing development. So they're dropping me off, and they would pull up really fast and the guys would scatter, and they used to get a kick out of that. So it's definitely, harassment and terrorism used with that. Not that they were able to get them because they ran away, but the point is, they can do that to just harass people, have them fearful of the police, and, just walking down the street doing nothing. And you was subjected at the time, as they were called, being tossed, and it's just unfortunate and unfair. And, I know they still do it to a degree, but not in that manner, because they need to be justified if they're going to stop and search someone. That's all I had to say.
Let me just add a footnote. Just to be clear, I didn't think that stop and frisk was a successful policy. In fact, it's, has been ruled unconstitutional. So I obviously am against it personally. I just want to say also that despite the fact that we no longer have stop and frisk as an official policy, the disproportionate stopping of people of color is still in place. So, that I think has to be acknowledged. So to Valerie's point, the peak, was 2011, when, roughly 700,000 New Yorkers were stopped under the stop and frisk, and 9% of them were people of color. So you're absolutely right, that was the peak of it. But you fast forward to like 2019, the stops data from the police show that there were about 13,459 stops. And again, 60% of those people were also people of color. So yes, drastic decline. I mean, 700,000 people compared to 14,000, that's a big, big difference. And I think that's a very good thing. My comment earlier had everything to do with the fact that despite the terribleness of the policy, it gave us one data point into the window of hypersurveillance. That's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Oh, Ivan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this. I just wanted to qualify it. And just because the stop and frisk has moved, or sort of maybe it's moved from the streets. They're no longer searching the young kids on the streets and the young people on the streets. It's moved on to the social media platforms. So now the young kids are being trolled. But that's a discussion for a different day. So it exists, but in a different form. So now the arrest and the prosecutions that we're getting from stop and frisk, which was very minimal, they're now getting from trolling young kids through their social media platforms. So it exists just in a different format. So we have to be very careful. The powers that be are very savvy, and they know that when the people resist, that they can't continue in a certain way. They're going to find different channels. But that's a conversation for a different day. Yeah.
Yo, thanks for bringing that point home. I got to jump off. I'm not sure about my colleagues, but class is in session, and we all got some homework to do. And yeah. Ivan and I and our fellow researchers, we went a long way. We started working on this stuff back in 2018 when we sit inside Tran class. Walking around, actually visited each development at least twice, right? Some of them more, right? Just trying to gather information. But what we need now is we need our community of leaders, which you all hear, some of your researchers yourself. We need y'all to, get as many people to this next conversation as possible, so we can start talking about some of these recommendations. Because if we don't bring the community and listen to them, then we're being just like how y'all spoke about the Preservation Act, with where you had a certain degree of people speaking for a whole community. We don't want to have that happen again. We have some recommendations that we put inside there. but there's also some that we didn't put inside there. But again, this will be unfair. We will be repeating the same system that we start speaking for the community and, ourselves and not letting them include a voice. So please, I'm calling everybody to action, right? Y'all say, us people inside these neighborhoods, little bad kids, don't do the right thing. Well, I was a kid that did a lot of dumb stuff, but I went and got educated. So my personal accountability started with me going inside that classroom and making sure that I can get a college degree and start offering programs all around, not only in New York City, but in other states as well. So other formerly incarcerated people can get college degrees, right? So after I did that and hold myself accountable, my family accountable, now it's time to hold these institutions accountable right now. In order to do that, we need everybody's help. And we need everybody here to come back with some type of solution and bring at least one other person with you for the policy aspect of this.
Thank you, Jay. And I just want to acknowledge that it's getting late and our speakers have I don't want to test their stamina too much. But at the same time, I know that there have been people who've had their hands up for a very long time. And so I want to get to the people who haven't spoken yet. So if we could take Christine, Wendy, and Giselle. Giselle, I've seen you pop on and off. I don't know if it has to do with your internet or not, but I just wanted to let you know that I see you. And if we could conclude the evening after those 3 questions. I'm sorry, Erica, that we won't be able to get to you again, but I just wanted to acknowledge the our speakers' time today. And
so Sarah, I have a suggestion. Can we take all of the comments and questions, and then Ivan and I can either respond or add any footnotes before we.
Okay.
It's probably easier for everyone.
That sounds good. So Will, I think if I'm understanding Dr. Tran correctly, that will unmute Christine, Wendy, and Giselle. They can pose their questions and make their comments, and then Ivan and Dr. Tran can respond kind of collectively.
Okay, was that my go to ask the question?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I didn't really catch that. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Just a little bit about myself, just to keep this concise. I'm a former UX, UI, and service designer with experience in advocacy against sexual assault. And this is the first time I've been hearing about NYCHA and just the pipelines from public housing to prisons. And I thank everyone for informing me because I'm very new to this. One question I had was wondering if it might be helpful to see this issue with NYCHA and the increase in surveillance from a design perspective, in addition to the disciplines and perspectives that are already exercised to address this problem. I sense a deep need to humanize the residents within the NYCHA territory. And I was wondering if there are already practices done to understand the residential culture, to understand where how they're feeling or what solutions they've come up with. Because I'm, just hearing, I'm sure there's grassroots initiatives, management work culture to see if like these landlords are taken care of, because it doesn't sound like they have the incentive to do a good job. And I'm also hearing a lot of just kind of conversation over like the currency, like how current the data is. And I'm wondering if it might be valid to kind of approach this problem in terms of almost like a user-centered perspective of saying, okay, the problem is we have to create a system that is not only relevant and responsive to the issue at hand, but also adaptable as the issue continues to escalate, because I'm sure their surveillance going to have a big pushback if the community comes up with a solution. And so I'm wondering, because I'm very new to this space, if this conversation has been had, and if so, I would love to join it and offer my experience in just like user and service design in general. So whoever can answer that, I am very open to that answer.
Thank you, Christine. And then we'll hear from Wendy and Giselle.
Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me? I'm from New York, so I'll try to talk very quickly. I wanted to thank the co-authors for this important study and for coming here to present it, and to our chairs for also putting this together. I wanted to point out that wonderful chairs also previously put together I don't know what to call it, presentation symposium on electronic surveillance and how people of color are misidentified quite frequently. And it's interesting that this is a study with 2010 data, which is before a lot of electronic surveillance was installed, not all, but a lot. And there's a lot more now, especially because municipalities think of it as a much more cost-effective way than actually using manpower. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I am wondering, considering that there's this huge error possible, how that will affect data and policy going forward. So that's sort of question one. Question two is, what kind of legislative initiatives would you like to see in place to counter this? I came up in the Rockefeller drug law eras, and I was in the court system as working for both a criminal judge, and then I worked for a civil court judge, and the civil court judge was tasked as part of an honor to a special court that dealt with NYCHA housing in a special drug offender not returning back to NYCHA part. So it was a very harrowing situation. There are no more Rockefeller drug laws, and so I don't know what's happened to that part, but I think that there is also a role for being able to go in and do education and speaking to judges. Like there's a space for that, for continuing education for judges, and I think that there's an interesting slot for this kind of representation. So those are my questions: surveillance, legislative initiatives. Oh, one last thing is, on our ballot in November, there are 4 proposals, and one is a racial equity plans and office. And I'm wondering if anybody has a plan for trying to work with this, should it be enacted. It looks like it's a positive initiative, but what does it actually mean? It could be a lot of words put out to sort of put people off and pacify, activists or the public or people seeking justice, or it could be a wonderful roadmap into effective change. So those are my questions, and I really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for coming and speaking and being involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And Giselle?
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? My name is Giselle Hearn. I am the Chief of Staff for Kristen Richardson Jordan, our City Councilwoman here in District 9. And I wanted to say, I really do appreciate this forum, because this is a topic that we talk about all the time in the office. And housing, prison, and holding the police accountable, and everything else that's wrapped up into this here is I know that we don't really get to the root, to the core of why things is happening, which is mental illness. We don't get to the core with this, which is poverty, and it's shameful to me because I lived in Harlem all my life. I lived here when Harlem was burnt down and the rats was just as big as the dogs, and we had to sleep next to them. So, and Harlem has never gotten the opportunity to get money to fix this community up. So now we're being we're picked up now because of all of the gentrification that's coming on and things like that. And the displacement is real. I live in Harlem River, where we are the first housing complex to become under PAC-RAD, and I know for a fact there's going to be a lot of displacement once they finish this here due to Section 8, because everybody that works here will not qualify for Section 8. So, and Kristen has the great idea that housing should remain housing, and we need to implement and change some things in there. And, everything that everyone said was so valid, because the education has to start at pre-K. You understand? And when people don't feel worthwhile, that's what they're going to give you. The people here in the projects feel hopeless, lost. They don't feel like they're worthy because nobody comes in and invests in our schools, our after-school programs. We have nothing here. So what do you want the young men to do when they stand on the corner and just congregate? They get harassed by that. But we need to put resources in here. There's no resources here that's going to be sustainable or help people. And the thing that I'm not understanding, with Columbia, why don't y'all offer people trade programs? Everything shouldn't have to be it, because everyone is not college material. So we do need some trade programs that's going to attract the community to want to do some stuff. We have some very talented people here, and I just really would like to see people come out and talk to the Black community and survey them about what it is that we need in our community for us to help ourselves, and so that's basically it. And I like, again, I'm grateful for this. And we also have a housing task force. I would love it if you would come to our housing task force, talk to some of the people there. We also join into the community board 10. We need to hit 9 and 11 as well because they're ours, but 10 is the main one. And we really would love for you to come out to our task force, to our ECRB task force, to talk about, solutions and making some policy changes. And I just wanted to say this here too, we need to get all of our elected officials to work together to make some changes. And I think that's a big problem for everything because everybody's off doing their own thing, trying to outsmart the other one and things like that, and getting the credit for this and that, and instead of working together to make changes, not only for the Black community but for the communities, period. And so that's basically all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you unmute and ask her a question real quick? Unmute her back. When you said Red Pack, I think you said Harlem River Houses. Did you say the first in Manhattan or under Red Pack, or because I wasn't too clear? Because I know they're going under it. I work with somebody.
No, we're not that. Well, so they wanted to do the Polo Grounds, but the Polo Grounds chose the Nicer Trust, which is a much better deal because they'll still remain Section 9, and they will have more control of what it is that is going over the development of them. We are a preservation because we are a landmark. And so they're saying that we are the first in Harlem to have it as a project, as a nicer complex, not, because Red Pack is all throughout the district, but as a project, we're the first one.
First one, okay, okay. So okay, that's what I was trying to, because I know Ocean Bay was one of the earlier ones. Okay, all right, yeah. And I'm not a fan. We're not going to debate.
We're not a fan either. We beg the people not to sign it. Yeah, we begged the people not to sign the leases. We begged them because we saw what was going to happen, and to be honest with you, we lost 10,000 Black families in this last census. We gained 20,000 white families, and so that's telling us that we're being priced out. We're being, there's just a whole lot of stuff going on, but I don't want to take up the time. Thanks. Please come to the meeting, call my office.
You can drop your information. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Go ahead,
So just to summarize quickly, Giselle, thank you for coming on behalf of Councilmember Jordan and for talking about disinvestment and displacement and the impact on your Harlem community. Wendy had two questions, one about how changes in surveillance technology will impact data moving forward in the future. And the second was, what kind of legislation do you want to see? And Christine's question was about whether anyone has tried using user experience design frameworks to address problems on behalf of NYCHA residents. And so now I'll turn it over to Ivan and Dr.
Tough questions. Great questions. Tough questions. With regards to surveillance, I mean, more research obviously is going to be required. There's no way to tell. Clearly, if we're saying that the minimal surveillance that there was in 2018 led to so many arrests, you can only imagine that we can assume, and maybe not correctly, but we can assume that enhanced surveillance will only lead to more arrests in these particular neighborhoods. And that's the way that the data seems to be the direction that the data seems to be leaning in, but we can't assume anything until we have all the information. So it'd be extremely interesting to find out what that does to the numbers. And how that impacts not just the numbers. I mean, that's one thing, but how that has affected the community at large, which is huge. Thank you, my brother. Appreciate you.
I apologize.
No, it's fine. I'm sorry, guys. In the middle of two meetings, I'm trying to choke. All right, thank you. What was the I'm sorry, what was the second question? I'm sorry, I'm trying to, my brain is
Yes. What legislation do you want to see? And has anyone tried using user experience design approaches with NYCHA residents?
wow. The user experience, I'm not sure. I'm not a big tech person. I'm actually pretty bad with tech. Legislation, as far as I'm not a, oh boy, I'm super skeptical of legislation for several reasons. I don't think there's ever been a law, a rule, a legislative piece of work that's come out that hasn't been weaponized against Black and Brown, no matter how well-intentioned the authors were and the people who sort of put it together were. I don't think there's ever been a piece of legislation that hasn't been weaponized against Black and Brown communities. I think that local communities can create their own policies, just like they can police themselves, and they can come up with their own solutions to the problems that they face. I think if we keep depending on legislatures to sort of get us out of this mess, we'll just keep getting wrapped up. And I'm not saying that that legislation is all bad. I'm saying personally, from personal experience, that I think that what we're doing here and that putting the power in the people's hands to create their own policies, to do their own thing, come up with their own solutions, it's what's super important. I think legislatures have let us down a lot, and they will continue to let us down. And that's just my personal opinion. So I'll pass the mic to Professor Tran, because I think I'm talking too much.
Well, I just want to say that I learned so much listening to all of you, and this is so exciting for me because, I think we are really getting to something important. So very, very briefly on the urban design aspect of NYCHA buildings, which Christine Lee asked. I would say the design is a big part of the problem because it allows for very effective surveillance to be done right now, given the way that architecturally these places are laid out, in columns vertically, and very, very uninviting, if you will, spaces sometimes for social interactions, and the lack of common spaces, the lack of resources for programming that Sandra has pointed to really made it harder for the young people who grew up in this housing project. In other cities, we have seen situations whereby people actually demolish public housing, basically, acknowledging that it's not salvageable. This has happened in Chicago, in St. Louis, where public housings were basically places of concentrated poverty with multiple social problems. New York City has taken a slightly different path because New York City is a city where housing is incredibly expensive and unaffordable. So any housing at all that we have, we should try to preserve, and that has been really the path forward. But to your point, I think we should not just renovate these places and these apartments as both Sandria and Giselle pointed to with the Harlem River houses. That entire kind of initiative is to renovate these units, which I'm sure will lead to displacement because of gentrification. So renovation is a big part of it, but also we have to re-envision public housing as places to live. And this comes back to the historical record, which is important. Harlem River houses, for example, were the first federal funded public housing project in the country that was built. And when it was built in the 1930s, 1935 to be more precise, it was seen as an emblem of hope, because these were middle class housing units that represented upward mobility for many of the families that moved into these buildings. And that has been the story of public housing across the country. So I think we need a moment of reckoning and re-envisioning of the entire NYCHA sort of complex with really a lot of funding and resources to be invested in these places. And this is coming back to Giselle's point as well about attacking the root causes of mass incarceration. And that's something that we must do because in our paper, the last recommendation that we had was to, basically reinvest in these communities. And again, we think of NYCHA developments as actual lived communities with people and families, and we need to invest in education, healthcare, social services. Mental health in particular is actually a very major issue because there's a lot of trauma that has been collected across generations in these places. The trauma of incarceration, but also of other family members affected by incarceration. So I think too often in our social policy envisioning, we think of dealing with the symptoms and not the causes, right? So the symptoms are easy, right? Okay, so how do we reduce policing? How do we, create, better policies that would hopefully curb the way in which police can sometimes abuse their power in poor communities and communities of color. But the causes are just so much deeper and requires a lot more reflection and also, reckoning with our own historical inequality and structural racism. That's the root causes of what we have been discussing today, not just, young men who had fewer opportunities and therefore engage in delinquent activities, which has been documented. So I think we need a broader conversation, and to do all of that, we need investment. And by that, I mean financial investment, but also social investment into these places. And to begin the process is, I think, to start with the humanizing of these individuals in these places. That people lived in these developments have names and families and faces and stories. And I think the more stories we can hear from these communities, the more likely that we're going to see the shared humanity of all New Yorkers, of all Americans, and that might help with the future revision of our NYCHA housing. And to the policy question, hopefully we can have more of that conversation on October 24th when we come back. And finally, Wendy, to your question about the rise of technology in surveillance, I asked Will to post a link to an NYU Brennan Center report on kind of NYPD's use of surveillance technology. Not all of them are applicable to NYCHA, but many of them are, and that really is the new reality that we're facing with, with the rise of AI, facial recognition, and so on. And as one of you pointed out, oftentimes, people misrecognize facial features, especially among communities of color, because, oh, a young Black man. Well, how many people do you run into on the street to a young Black man? They all look the same for some, to some. And I think that's the problem, that we have to be very cautious with technology. I think we have great opportunities, but also it could cause great peril and great damage if we're not careful with how we're using the technologies. And also recognize the limit of such technologies in sort of helping us move towards a better and more equal future that would be safe and secure, I think, for hopefully most NYCHA residents, if we can make that a reality. So with that, I would just pause here and I turn back to you, Sandria and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tran. What amazing words to close with. And thank you everyone for the robust conversation tonight. This committee never fails to bring all of your curiosity and interests and questions to bear, and a great concern for our community. So thank you very much. Wendy, I'm sorry I didn't get to your question about the ballot proposal. That was my error. I apologize for that. But I encourage everyone to submit your comments, thoughts, feedback, solutions, and to info@cb8m.com and put CB8 social justice in the subject line so we can collect them for our next meeting that Sandria has said repeatedly is October 24th. And please share that email information to your network so other folks can, we can distribute the information so we can collect as much feedback as possible. And so Sandria, I'll throw it to you for the close. Thank you everybody so much.
Oh, I'm the closer. Uh-oh, trouble. All right, well, thank you all for joining. I don't want to say a special thanks to because I don't want to seem like I'm showing favoritism, but thank you for the panelists that did that work. Your the authors, thank you all 3 of y'all. It was phenomenal, good information. I can't wait till next month. It's 2 days before my birthday, so that's gonna be a birthday present to hear about policy. And thank you all for joining. Yes, we never fail, right? We always have a good, robust meeting. I'll say that public housing is the only true affordable housing in the country, 30% of your income, no roommate needed. Everybody is not dirt poor in public housing. It's a mixed bag of income. So that's another stereotype that, everybody's poverty stricken. No, that's not, it's from low to medium income. So I just wanted to add that. And I believe it was the first houses built in New York City and East Village. So I just want to add that before they were built before Harlem River houses. And with that said, thank you all. Let's see what's next. What we got to ask. Any old business, or which one is first? Yeah, old business. Okay, I'm good. Any old business? Seeing none. Any new business? No new business? Okay, so a motion to close?
Second.
Second, okay. All right. Wendy got her hand up. So good night, everybody. Thank you.
Great.
Look